All right, we're good to go. All right. So again, welcome guests and panelists to our 2021 virtual conversation. Although we miss gathering together and sharing the great art, culture, and experiences of Asia and the Pacific Islands, we are fortunate that technology has helped to continue our experience of sharing. The book, A Good Provider is One Who Leaves, chronicles the 30-year, three-generation history of a Filipino family and its migration to the Middle East and ultimately to the US. It covers global immigration, the impact of remittances on the global economy, the importance of family, sacrifices made and relationships renewed, impact of Asians on the US healthcare system, and more. Our friend here, Jason DeParle, is a New York Times reporter and has written extensively about poverty and immigration, and now resides in the Washington, D.C. area. His book, American Dreams, Three Women, 10 Kids, and a Nation's Drive to End Welfare, was a New York Times notable book and won the Helen Bernstein Award from the New York City Library, which is one of my favorite places to go whenever I'm back home. He was an Emerson Fellow at New America, and he is a recipient of the George Polk Award and is a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Kathy Cochin has served 11 years as president and CEO. I'm sorry, take that back. Kathy Cochin is the CEO of Jasper Inclusions Advisors, which advises on philanthropic strategy. Through 2020, she served as president and CEO of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum for over a decade. As a leader in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, her networks stretch across 35 states and the Pacific. From 2014 through 2017, she was a member of President Obama's Advisory Commission on AAPIs, which stands for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Kathy is also a friend of AICH and has led a discussion for our own CHIP, the Crane House Young Professionals. And she currently resides in Oakland, California. So all, welcome to our talk. And so without further delay, please join me in welcoming both Kathy and Jason for our inaugural 2021 virtual conversation. Kathy.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you so much. And it's so nice to be warmly welcomed again back to Asia Institute Crane House, even though this is virtual as opposed to being in person. And I'm just delighted to be in conversation with Jason. We've known each other for a couple years now. I mean, 2020 was a blur, but I think it's been a couple years since the book first came out. And I just found it so fascinating, and I learned so much from the book as well as getting to know Jason. And so I've been really, really happy to support him and really promoting the book. It's been really great. So I do have a few questions for him, and then the second half of the hour, we'll open it up for Q&A, and you can start to put questions in the Q&A section if you'd like, and then Joel and I will monitor that, and in the second half of the hour that we've got, we can start to look at those questions. So Jason, just starting from the very beginning, why and how did you end up in the Philippines? What was your original intention, and how did that change over time?
Thanks, Kathy and Joel. Thanks for your generous welcome, and thanks for your friendship. I got to the Philippines in 1987, not because I was interested in migration, but I was interested in slum life in a developing world, and I wanted to live in a developing world country. And I've been reporting on poverty in America. I wanted to understand better what it was like abroad. So I had a fellowship from an organization called the Henry Luce Foundation. And we could pick from 11 Asian countries. Manila was the place where I thought I could get farthest with English. So I kind of stumbled my way there. And after a few months in Manila, I was working in an office and not really meeting enough Filipinos, and I was doing office work. I wanted to get out into the community more, so I decided to try to move into a squatter area, and wound up met a nun who introduced me to a family that was willing to take me in. Like I said, I went there because I was interested in their lives in the squatter community. But it turned out that I was interested in poverty, not migration, but migration was the way the family survived. The father was abroad in Saudi Arabia working as a guest worker. The mom was home raising 5 kids with the money he sent back. We became good friends, stayed in touch for many, many years. And eventually all 5 of those kids, like the father, grew up to become overseas workers. And they're part of a big extended family. There's, for the Filipinos in our audience will understand, there's 40 first cousins just on one side of the family. Well, 3/4 of them wound up working abroad. So through my 30 years of friendship with this family, I felt like I had a lens into the rise of global migration across the world. Like everything that could happen, kind of good or bad, it happened to someone in this extended family. The person I knew the best was the middle daughter of the family. The mother was Tita. Her middle daughter was a girl named Rosalie, who was 16, a 16-year-old shy Filipino schoolgirl when I met her, who was thinking about joining the convent and instead managed to get her way into nursing school and grew up to become a nurse. As you mentioned in your introduction, spent many years in the Middle East, all the while hoping to get to the United States. And she eventually did. And I went along to accompany her. Literally flew to the Philippines and flew with her back to Texas, and then chronicled her first 3 years of adaptation in the US with her husband and her kids.
So the title, A Good Provider is One Who Leaves. Where does the title come from, and why did you choose it?
It comes from one of Tita's sisters. Tita's one of 11 children in her family. 9 of those 11 went abroad or had husbands who did. So again, this kind of wonderful natural data set of people who had experienced overseas life. One of her sisters, one of my favorite of her siblings, a woman named Peachy, was watching her siblings go abroad, and they grew up on a farm and lived in nipa huts with thatched roofs. And she was seeing her siblings and their families come back and build cement block houses. She turned to her husband and said that he needed to go abroad too. He should go to Saudi Arabia because she wanted to improve her housing. And she told him, a good provider is one who leaves. And it became kind of the motto of the family, to get ahead, one goes away. It's so counterintuitive to the American way of thinking. The good provider stays at home with his children, but I think it encapsulated the paradox to provide for your children, you had to leave them, or to provide for them the way you would hope.
Yeah, so your book is really quite epic, tracing three generations, but also 30 years and many different countries. And then one thing that you and I have talked about all along has been kind of the cultural differences. So in what ways do Filipinos see this story differently than Americans who don't have a proximal immigration experience in their family?
Let me back up just a second, Kathy, and tell you the way I met the family, which I think captures a little bit of our relationship and help us get to the question. So I met this nun. I said, I want to move into a squatter area. And first she tried to put me up, the last thing they need is you. But she didn't say it quite that way, but they'll feel like I need to cook you special food. You'll be a burden. They don't have indoor plumbing. You're just going to be a problem. And then she said, finally, we really need to build better relationships between the people of the first and the third world. So maybe I'll think about this. Come back in a few days. I'll think about it. I thought in the meantime, she would approach a family or two and see if somebody would be interested in it. And instead, she just took me by the hand and she led me through the squatter area and kind of auctioned me off on the spot. I knew a little Tagalog, just enough to know, like, everybody was horrified at this idea. Hindi puede, sister. No, it's not possible. You can't. And so the first person turned us down, the second person, and the third person was Tita, who was just struck mute by the thought of, like, how scruffy I had, long hair and a beard, and like this guy moving in. Plus her husband's overseas. She's there with the 5 kids. Imagine. And finally, Sister Christine, very impatient woman, said, well, if you don't want to pass him on to somebody else, don't cook him anything special. If he gets sick, too bad. And she walks off, and Tita and I are standing. I don't know who was more frightened of the other, me or Tita. After like a 2-hour conversation, she finally agreed to let me move in, thinking that Sister Christine wanted her to do it and that she was sort of obligated. So it was a very unlikely beginning of a lifelong friendship. I mean, we were from other opposite ends of the world, gender, class, nationality, and we became really close friends. And they stayed in touch with me. I think as much as I stayed in touch with them. I lived there for about 8 months. I was in the Philippines for a total of about a year, and I left, and I didn't really know if I would ever see them again, but we did, and we stayed close. You asked what did I learn from them? What really struck me above everything else was how completely devoted they were to family. I mean, it was just at the center of their universe. It was the center of their meaning. It was also the center of economic life. The extended family was the social safety net. I mean, they could. I slept on Tita's floor, but I was one of like 3 or 4 other boarders, mostly relatives coming in from the provinces to go to school in Manila. They lent to each other, they borrowed from each other. They back on the farm, they were in and out of each other's houses without permission. And the husband, Emmett, who came back in the middle of my stay there and whom I got to know quite well, had made this just extraordinary sacrifice for his children when his youngest child was still a baby when he left, and really never was gone for 20 on and off for 20 years. So, if there's one thing that I took away from the difference in our cultures, it was the American emphasis on individuality, and it's all about promoting your own self, whereas in Filipino life, it gave me a very different sense of values. And it plays out in migration, of course, because the sacrifices, you go abroad to help the family. I mean, when Rosalie, the daughter, first went abroad, I felt, gosh, this is a tragedy. I initially, if this is 15, 20 years after I met them, all along I was thinking her father's sacrifice would make it possible for her not to have to go to do that. She got the opportunity to do that. I was thinking, poor Rosalie, she has to go abroad. She was thinking, lucky me, I get to go abroad, because not everybody gets that opportunity. It's the more fortunate of the less fortunate, if you will, that can get that. So she thought it was opening up a new opportunity for her to go abroad, and in fact, take the burden off her parents and replace her father as the overseas worker in the family. That was a real, it took me a long time to understand that change. I mean, you would think, okay, I heard it and I got it, but it really was hard for me to understand that why she saw herself as lucky rather than unfortunate. And that continued throughout, even when she married and had kids and was separated them for a long time. I think she always, as painful as that was, I don't want to underestimate the pain in any way, but she always saw the opportunity in being abroad. She didn't see herself as a less fortunate for having to do that. She saw herself as more fortunate.
Yeah, so you speak about kind of this collective identity as opposed to very individualistic identity, kind of, so individual identity being very Western and collective identity being very kind of Eastern, if you will. So I was also thinking about this question of cultural adaptation and assimilation, and how strong like Filipino values have remained across different generations and across different countries that they've lived in. You've really seen it up close with the larger Portagana family, and then specifically the Camotes families. Can you just provide some perspective on what you think those, Filipino values
So
are?
Rosalie and I go to Manila, we get on the plane, we fly to the United States. This has been her lifelong dream. She wanted to come to the States for 20 years. She finally gets there. I take her to my house in suburban Washington for a couple of days before we go to Texas. And she gets kind of quiet and looks a little like worried. And she said, well, your neighborhood's really quiet. And I said, yeah, it's great. And she said, well, it seems like the kind of place you have to have an appointment to go in your neighbor's house. I said, well, yeah, you don't just walk in. You have to have an appointment. And you just tell, from the start, from the moment she landed, she felt like at odds with the American ethos of individuality. Quiet to her meant lonely. Having to ask permission meant some kind of lack of community, isolation. It started to play out when the kids went to school, and the teachers would teach them to think for themselves, which was not something Rosalie liked at all. She would actually tell him, no, you're not supposed to think for yourself. You're supposed to listen to me. Uh, uh, and it became a point of a slight irritant to me, I would say, as I watched her, she calls me Kuya. So I'm big brother. I'm somewhere between, a journalist and a relative in my complicated relationship with Rosalie. So the part of me was thinking, Rosalie, she was very much, her view of Galveston was she was part of a group of 20 Filipino nurses who all started together. And she wanted to do everything with the Filipino nurses. What they thought, she thought. If they wanted to move to X neighborhood, she was going to move to X neighborhood. If they were going to put their kids in this school, she was very much, in American terms, following the pack. And I felt like frustrated at times the way she would make her decisions, because I felt like she was always deferring to the group. I mean, it wasn't my place to be frustrated. This was frustrated in my conversations with myself. I was there as an observer, but I was thinking, Rosalie, just because she's doing, why do you have to, And I talked to a sociologist of immigration about this, and he was saying actually he saw real strength in that, that there was a kind of wisdom in the group. And he was also noting that it kind of depends on the group. So if you come in and your group is low skilled, low education, you might be getting less helpful steers. But in the case of the Filipino nurses, they're educated. Many of them had relatives in the States. Rosalie was kind of the beneficiary of that community wisdom. And so she made decisions that about where to send the kids to school and where to move that I thought at the time were kind of groupthink. And I now look back in retrospect and think of more as a sign of strength. So she ends up, after a couple of years in the United States, moving with 5 other Filipino nurses, all decide to move, 6 of them together decide to move to this one subdivision in the suburbs. And 3 of them, including Rosalie, 2 others, live on the same cul-de-sac. And it eventually occurred to me she had recreated the strength of the family compound or the squatter community. She had childcare when she had an emergency. She had rides to work. She had Pancit to take back and cross the cul-de-sac. I mean, she had her community there, and it was a source of real practical strengths, and also, I think, emotional reassurance for her. So I ended up seeing a wisdom in what she was doing that wasn't initially apparent to me.
That's so interesting, really interesting. When we picture migration, we tend to think of men crossing the border for work, but the migration that you wrote about a lot was driven by women, Rosalie in particular. And then, with her husband, Chris, there had been struggles, of many different types, and as well as his struggles as the role of the man of the house or man of the family, whereas Rosalie was, for many times, the main provider or the primary provider. Can you say more about your observations of the gender dynamics of migration?
Huge surprise. Probably the biggest surprise of the reporting in Texas was how much gender conflict there was in these families. So again, just like when I went into the squatter area, I wasn't thinking about migration, and there it was in front of me. When I went to Texas, I wasn't thinking about gender dynamics. I was thinking about migration. I was following this woman, and yet it just came up all the time. Wow. Step back and think about it. These are women who are coming for their professional opportunities, and they're bringing their families with them. There's been a great feminization, as you, of course, know, globally for decades. And it's really playing out in the Philippines, particularly among nurses. These are really well-paying jobs. And so the men are following their women's professional opportunities, and often for the men are experiencing some sort of downward mobility. I mean, the women come, they've got the jobs in the hospital. The men were going to work at Whataburger, the fast food in Texas. They lacked, sometimes they had professional credentials that didn't translate. Sometimes they didn't have the professional credentials. They were coming for their families. So there was a lot of really suppressed, or sometimes not suppressed, resentment among it. And initially I thought, it was idiosyncratic, or this family or that family. And I actually found an ethnography of Indian nurses where it really played out exactly the same. A woman who'd followed dozens of Indians, and same issues with the men. So in Rosalie's case, she was really the breadwinner. It's a traditional society. The men are, it's a paternalistic society. The men are want to be the head of the household, but yet they're following the women. The women are making the money. There was it played out in a lot of different ways. Some men openly bragged to me about the affairs they were having. That they were. I mean, like, I didn't ask, but they told. Another guy just, I mean, they were bringing up. I wasn't like asking, how's your masculine ego doing? I mean, we'd be sitting around, and then another guy said, well, I'm just the man wife. She's the boss. I just take the orders. I sit at home. I raise the kids. He was laughing about it. Like, some guys were like overcompensating by trying to be overly macho. Other guys were sort of mocking themselves. And it was really complicated in Rosalie's family. Her husband is a wonderful father, very warm, but he, I think, kind of resented. They had very different views of money and a lot of conflict about it. And the women, there was a kind of in academic circles, there was a view, I think, initially when migration feminized, that this would be a liberating thing for the women. They could free themselves from the oppression of male dominance. They'd have their own source of income, death to the patriarchy. And the way it played out, I think, in a lot of the lives, is that the women they wanted to pump up, they wanted strong men for their children. They wanted to be in good marriages with strong men. They didn't really want to be the dominant. So Rosalie is a very traditional woman in her values, even if untraditional in her economic life. So she would just go through things that to me seemed real elaborate efforts to kind of prop up Chris as the putative head of the household. So when they bought this house in the suburbs, she took out the mortgage all in her name, but put his name on the lease. On the deed. So they owned it together, but she had, it was constantly things like that. But she wanted to present and preserve him as the strong male of the family. And the women were doing that all the time with the men. It was just really interesting to watch how everybody kind of had to adapt to that.
Wow.
I think, and for the most part, did so, I would say, with a fair amount of grace. I mean, it was difficult for the men. It was difficult for the women. They worked their way through it. It was painful for a lot of people, but I ended up kind of admiring the accommodations they came to with each other. For almost all of them stayed together, and they made it. It was hard, but they made it.
Wow, that's great. So immigration policy is slated to be a really big issue for the Biden administration. What recommendations or insights do you have, especially regarding Filipino immigration? So having worked in Asian American communities for, basically my whole career for 40 years, I know that even with legal immigration for Filipinos, it's a 23-year wait to get visas if you're not like H1 visas or special training like nurses. Otherwise it's 23 years to wait. One of the refreshing things about your book is that it shows a side of immigration that's not really focused on in the immigration policy conversation. So a lot of the immigration policy conversation is about the undocumented, but in Rosalie's case, it's about people who have come legally, who've come through all the right channels, and yet how challenging these processes still are. So do you have any recommendations for the Biden administration on immigration?
When I first started working on the book, I thought if you were going to write a book about immigration, you wouldn't choose a Filipino family. I thought it was sort of peripheral, right? And particularly, she's in the beginning, she was living in Abu Dhabi. It was really peripheral. And then she comes to the States. I'm still thinking this is going to be a not very representative look at immigration. She's not Latino, as you say, she's here legally, so she's relatively privileged as a nurse. And I came away, so I thought of it initially as a weakness in the narrative. I mean, I didn't choose it. Our friendship chose it. It was a book I was writing not to be representative, but to grow out of a relationship. But as I ended up thinking it was fortuitous because, as you well know, I didn't at the time, but Asians outnumber Latinos among recent immigrants. Educated immigrant, the majority of immigrants now come with college educations. The majority are actually living in the suburbs. So initially, I was thinking Rosalie's very exceptional. Well, I think for the face of modern immigration, and of course, the majority of immigrants are here legally. So I didn't choose it that way at all, but I ended up thinking that she was quite representative, and I think representative in another way, which would be helpful for the administration to keep in mind, because I think the assumption is that assimilation is broken. We hear so, at least among critics of immigration, we hear constantly that people no longer want to assimilate. And she achieved in 3 years a degree of assimilation that I think used to take 3 generations. And 3 years after she arrived, she had a house in the suburbs, kids on the honor roll, everybody was speaking English. If they were forgetting the Tagalog, we started when the kids first got here. She was saying, "We're only going to speak Tagalog in the house. You're going to constantly remember never going to forget your Filipino language." And like within 6 months, that was it pours in on the phones, it's on the TV. It's just the assimilative power of American culture is so profound. I mean, Rosalie and Chris were consciously vowing to keep it out of the house, and they couldn't. I mean, they were trying to watch Tagalog soap operas and Tagalog TV, and the kids were all on Disney. I mean, there was no stopping it. And I think that America, the United States as a whole, tends to underappreciate what a powerful job it's doing on incorporating people from different cultures. And I mean, yes, there are problems, there are subgroups, but by and large, I still feel pretty optimistic about America's power to blend and bring together people without losing their particular, e pluribus unum. Not that it all becomes blended out and everybody becomes the same culture, but to bring cultures together. I certainly see that happen in her life.
Yeah, that assimilation story is so familiar to me. I'm the child of immigrants, and they tried to speak only Chinese at home, and that was fine before I went to school. I'm the oldest one, but once I went to school, they'd speak to me in Chinese, but I always responded in English. Always. I still understand. I'd always responded in English. So totally understand.
You hear another critique. I actually read a lot of the anti-immigration literature and to understand the critique, and I tried to line it up against Rosalie's experience. So one of the other critiques is that we no longer promote patriotism in our schools, and so immigrants don't learn enough about American heroes. Okay, sounds good on paper, but then, and I was going to school with the kids, and the schools were great. They just let me, I went to second, third grade with Rosalie's kids. They were studying Rosa Parks, Cesar Chavez, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. Her little, the youngest child, boy, came home and said, "Mommy, there was a president named Abraham Lincoln, and he gave the Spaghettisburg Address." They learned George Washington's rules of civility. I mean, Laura, the middle child, just got fascinated with Rosa Parks and with Harriet Tubman. Here's a really interesting story. She was really interested in Harriet Tubman because she not only freed other slaves, but she took great risks for people, even though they weren't her relatives. So you can see the little Filipino girl. Laura was 7 or 8 years old, I think, and she knows the value of the family, everything. She's grown up with this, the family. Now she's reading about somebody who serves people who aren't in her family. And you kind of see she loved that Rosa Parks didn't swear at the policeman when she got pushed off the bus. She didn't say any bad words. So the American in her liked it, that she stood up for her rights. The Filipino in her liked her, that she treated her elders or treated people with, authority figures, with respect. You could see the mixing and matching of different cultural strengths and values in a way that I think was the whole being stronger than the sum of the parts. She blended it into, it wasn't quite native born American and wasn't quite Filipino, but it was adaptive and beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. So I do want to remind the guests that if you have questions, I'm going to move into kind of the last question or two with Jason. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. If you hover at the very bottom, you'll see a Q&A button, and just go there and type it in, and we'll be able to get to your question. So Jason, Rosalie is a nurse, And how did nursing become such an important pathway for Filipinos? And did Rosalie view it as a job or a calling? You talked about, she was thinking about going to a convent, just curious about her own motivations.
So two questions. How did nursing get to be a thing in the Philippines? Colonialism. The U.S. acquired the Philippines in 1899 in a war with Spain, and within a few years, actually, the Rockefeller Foundation had funded, as part of civilizing the little brown brother, the imperialist sort of project. But part of that was to uplift society by transplanting American nursing schools and start training elite Filipinos to learn nursing. So they learned on an American curriculum in English. And as early as the teens, you started having elite nurses from elite families go to the US for sort of postgraduate training. So there had been a pre-World War II, I think, a stream of elite nurses training in the U.S., sometimes staying in the U.S., sometimes bringing U.S. back to nursing knowledge back to the Philippines. And then after World War II, there was an exchange program. Oh, excuse me. Fomented an exchange program, Cold War era exchange program devised, meant to promote cultural exchange, and thousands of nurses came to the U.S. through that post-Cold War period.
Jason, we've lost your video.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me see.
I can still hear you just fine, but I've lost your video. Joel, I can't hear you.
I can still see Jason, but his videos stopped, but I can still hear him. So
I can still hear you, but
Yeah.
I can't see you. But that's okay.
that's okay. We can still hear you, Kuya Jason. Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I see it's
Okay.
frozen.
It's okay.
So anyway, you were talking about nursing and the exchange. Oh, there you go. You're back.
Okay.
The exchange.
You're back.
No, this was set up as a cultural exchange between, and it became kind of a little bit abused as a backdoor way for hospitals to recruit underpaid nursing labor. So throughout the 50s and 60s, you had a growing number of Filipino nurses coming through this kind of backdoor channel and finding ways to stay in the U.S. So when the 65 immigration law passed and opened up the legal opportunities for straightforward skilled migration for people from Asia, there had been a long period of, the pathways, the professional affiliations, the networks had already been established. Everybody, lots of nurses had an auntie or a cousin or somebody, the networks were already there. And so it took off, and it became for Filipinos of both genders, but particularly women, just one of the most promising ways of upward mobility. I mean, if you're a Filipino woman from anything but from any kind of average family, there's few better pathways up. For you asked about Rosalie, she did initially want to be a nun. She decided not to go to the convent because she didn't want to take a vow of poverty. It wasn't the giving up of family or children that initially put her off. Is that she was very close to this nun who lived and worked in Levarisa, and the nun was from a very wealthy Filipino family who had foregone her wealth and moved into the slums and was always lecturing the poor people in the Philippines about the virtues of poverty. And Rosalie thought she wanted to serve Jesus, but she didn't want to stay in poverty. So nursing became very much a vocation. That some of the favorite moments I had with her was the hospital also let me just follow her around and to see her pray. I mean, she didn't force her religion on other people, but they sensed it in her, some of them. And you're really seeing people in the middle of the night in terrible need and wanting to pray with her, and she would respond that way. And it was really moving to see. It really was. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. So as a public health professional, I just have to take this moment to talk about Filipino nurses. 4% of all US nurses are Filipino, but 30% of all the nurses who have died from COVID were Filipino. It's just such a disproportionate impact. Also, in certain places, Filipino healthcare workers are disproportionately significant. So in California, 20% of the nursing workforce is Filipino, even though Filipinos are something about 6% of the total population. And 25% of Filipinos in New York work in the healthcare arena. So Jason, what do you think might be some of the reasons for some of this disproportionate impact of COVID, in particular on Filipino nurses?
I don't think we know for sure, but we can, I think, reasonably speculate about several factors. I'm not sure how to weight them, but for one, Filipinos work really hard, long hours. We're often drawn to shifts with harder shifts to get the differential pay. Almost all the nurses that I followed in Galveston were sending significant amounts of their salary back home. So they have financial pressures on them to work. So one can imagine they're have an economic need to take some of the risks. I think they're also take a kind of pride in their devotion and their lack of complaining. There was a kind of subdrama going on inside the hospital of the Filipinos feeling like the American nurses were giving them the hardest cases. This is pre-COVID, when Rosalie first got there, but that they would give them the heaviest patients, the sickest patients. And sometimes they complained to each other about it, but there was also this kind of element of, we're better nurses, so we can do it. One can imagine that if there's a difficult situation, the Filipinos being dutiful, trained and proud of their commitment to their patients would take the risks. I think there's also been some speculation about whether some of them have underlying health issues that would make them, particularly as being raised in some of them like Rosalie in very low income situations would have some underlying health situations that might make them more vulnerable. But I'm not entirely sure we know what mix of those factors it is.
Yeah. Well, I know that the time has just flown by, so I want to give Jason some time to do a reading, and then I know that there'll be a slideshow, and then we can get to the questions.
There's a passage, Kathy, that in the book that comes after a mention of a cost-benefit study that showed immigrants bringing more economic growth than they took in services and contributing more in taxes than they consumed in services. I wrote a little bit about that study, but then in thinking about Rosalie's story, cost-benefit analysis alone doesn't do it justice. Rosalie's escape from Leverisa, the squatter camp where she was raised, is a minor miracle. Migration is her vehicle of salvation. It delivered her from the living conditions of the 19th century. It respected her talent, rewarded her sweat, and enlarged her capacity for giving. It made her life deeper, fuller, and more filled with hope. It's great that migration helped her help others. It's also great that it helped her help herself. That her quest ended in Texas is something for Americans to cheer. It's good for your country to be the place people go to make dreams come true. The new house that Rosalie had moved into had everything she wanted. Laminate wood floors, a double-door fridge, premium cabinets, a big tub where a nurse could soak her legs. The garage alone was bigger than the house in Leverisa where we had met. Each of the kids had a separate room, but they were scared to sleep alone in a house so big. For months, they curled up beside Rosalie and Chris, Filipino style. When I asked Rosalie how the house compared to the hovel where we met, with the leaks, the rats, heat, stench, crowds, she couldn't find the words. I couldn't either. Oh my God, she told the kids, big difference. Mommy didn't have it like this. Mommy grew up in a shanty. Christine looked up from her phone. What's a shanty, Mommy? She said.
That's beautiful. Well, Jason, thank you
That's
so much.
assimilation.
That's
The-
beautiful.
What's a shanty, mommy?
I am so my heart is so enriched from hearing your conversation. Oh my goodness, I'm tearing right now by hearing that. So, everyone, what Jason would like to do is start a PowerPoint presentation just to give us all an idea of the family that he visited while he was there in the Philippines. And I'm excited to ask you a couple of questions after this. We have a queue of about 6 questions here as well. So. Um, let's start with the first slide, Jason. So,
Leverisa, 1987. Yeah.
yeah, 1987.
That was the area. That's what it, and that's what it looked like.
All right. So, you ready for the next slide?
Sure. You can just go, you can
Okay.
go through. We can do it quick.
Okay, no problem.
That's Tita and Emmett on their wedding day. I love that picture. Just the two of them so solemn.
I'll tell you, like I said beforehand, my mother and father have the exact same type of wedding album and wedding pictures. And next time I go visit my family back in Jersey City, New Jersey, I'm going to take a whole bunch of pictures.
It's 1967, but it feels like another century, doesn't it? Yeah.
Right. I think that's about the same time my parents did get married, about mid 60s. Definitely.
That's right before Emmett, Rosalie's father, first went abroad to Saudi Arabia. He went abroad as a pool cleaning sales, a pool technician. He was cleaning a government pool in Manila and got offered a job in Saudi Arabia doing exactly the same work at 10 times the pay. So Tita may have been pregnant in that picture. Their youngest child, see, if you see there's 4 kids in that picture. The 5th one was born soon after, right as Emmett left to go abroad.
All right, so let's look at the pay difference there.
Yeah, that's his work permit in Saudi. So he was making $50 a month and 500 when he went to Saudi. So there's a story we kind of skipped over, but actually, can you go back just a second, Joel?
Yeah.
Rosalie, all the way to the left there, the little girl on our left, that's Rosalie's second from left. That's her big sister, Rowena. She was born with a heart defect, and they were living in this shanty, and they couldn't afford medicine, and the roof was leaking, and Emmett was constantly worried about losing his child, and he at one point get down on his knees and he said, Lord, make a decision, take her or leave her, like cure her, God, or, take her with you to heaven. And the way I tell the story in the book is God answered in a mysterious way. Like a few weeks later, Emmett gets this job offer to go overseas and work in Saudi Arabia. He'd be living in an Islamic autocracy 5,000 miles from home and be away from his wife and children for 2 years. But on the other hand, he'd make 10 times the money. And to save Rowena and get her the medicine that she needed, he answered on the spot.
Oh, that was amazing.
It's quite a sacrifice. Yeah.
All right. Who's that handsome man right there?
Would you want this man moving in your, sleeping on your floor? Hi, I'm here from the U.S. I told you.
Is that Rosalie with you?
That's Tita. That's Rosalie's mom.
Tita. Wow,
Yeah.
She looks great. Really
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. There's Tita.
So there's another sub story in the book about all these eggs. She had a job in working for Sister Christine the Nun. They had this slum uplift group, and they had a food co-op. And Tita's job was to bring in 2,000 eggs a week and distribute them to some of the other salesmen and collect all the money. So she was like the egg lady, and eggs just haunted her life. She had to stack them in her house under this fluorescent light to keep the rats from eating them, and she was constantly worried about eggs breaking or losing the money. I began to think of the fragility of the eggs as like a metaphor for her life. That her efforts at economic progress had that level of fragility.
Wow. I'll go to the next slide, but let me ask you a question since I have this point of privilege. Have you ever had balut?
I try to think that I'm somehow Filipino inside, but it hasn't gone that. Yes, I have had it, but I can't say that that it's moved me. You know what?
Yeah.
Went with Rosalie in Houston when she was getting her taxes done to a Filipino accountant, and they were selling balut out of the accountant's office.
Wow.
So you had to eat balut in the waiting room while you waited to see the accountant.
That is so funny. Yeah. I'm similar to you. I've tried it just to try it, but I'm not a big fan. All right. Next
I love this
picture.
picture of Rosalie graduating nursing school. On the back of it, Tita had tallied all her debts of money that she'd borrowed from various relatives. So, you think on the back of a graduation photo, it's going to be "Thank you, Jesus, for getting my daughter through nursing school." Instead, it was this accounting of all the people money she still owed money to.
How funny. All right.
So I went back. I left the Philippines in 1980. I was there 86 to 87. I left. I didn't see Rosalie again for 20 years, and we stayed in touch throughout that time. But I finally went back 20 years later and wrote a piece about her for the New York Times Magazine, and that's what the book grew out of. And when I started visiting much more often, so there's a 20-year gap between or almost a 20-year gap between those two pictures. And that was Rosalie on the cover of the New York Times Magazine when she was still living in Abu Dhabi.
Um,
That's Christine on the left and Dominique Boy in the middle and Precious Lara on the right. Lara was the one who got fascinated with Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. Yeah.
that picture could just be my cousins who live in Jersey City right now. Very, very similar. So beautiful.
On the beach in Galveston. Yeah. So Christine, the eldest, she's now a senior in high school.
Oh, she's a senior?
And Laura's a sophomore and Dominique's in 8th grade. Yeah.
How quickly grew. I assume this is their house in Galveston,
That's
Texas.
the house that in the Filipino cul-de-sac, and it was a real financial stretch for her to buy it. And I was thinking, oh gosh, Rosalie, I might wait a little on that one, but she was going with. That was one of those moments where she was following the Filipino collective wisdom in a way that made me nervous, but in retrospect, it was a great decision.
Yeah, it's so funny when I look at this picture. It reminds me of my time living in the States, but also coming back from the Philippines not too long ago. And you mentioned it, Jason, when Rosalie mentioned that, can you not just walk into your neighbors' houses and
Uh-huh.
visit them? Because what I remember when I came back to the States from the Philippines, just recently, about a year and a half ago, I just remember how quiet it was in the United States and how there were not as many people. That was one thing that, for me, was one thing that
No
struck
roosters
me.
crowing, right?
Right, exactly. All right, let's see. There you go.
As much as I've devoted as much time of my life I've devoted to trying to tell this story, and I still kind of marvel at it myself and feel like I haven't given it adequate voice. Sometimes I think I would have done better. I didn't have to write the book. I could have just shown those two pictures. I mean, that's the most dramatic before and after. What's the trope they do on Twitter now? How it started, how it ended.
Yeah.
I've made my career at the New York Times writing stories about anti-poverty programs and anti-poverty stories, and it's Rosalie's is the greatest anti-poverty success story I know.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, before we get into our queue of questions, we have about 6 questions here. I have a couple of questions for you. It's funny, I have a boy in my family. I have a Judette in my family. There's a Rosalie and Rowena too in my family. So it's all the names are very, very interchangeable. But my first question to you is, my family's not that different from Rosalie's family. And I remember going back and seeing the poverty that was in the Philippines. But among the my cousins, I don't really feel as though they missed much in poverty. In poverty, I felt like, yeah, maybe there were physical things that they missed up, but the communion that they have together and the fellowship they have together was great. And I just wondered if you noticed the same thing too. If I know there's poverty of physical things, but being in the States, I see people who have almost everything, but still lack communion or fellowship, and that's something that they pay for with a pill or something else. And I just wonder if that's something that you've noticed as well.
Absolutely. I don't want to romanticize
Yeah, no, no,
the
exactly.
hardships, the economic hardships and the sacrifices that came with them, and the what it must have been like for somebody like Emmett to not have medicine for his
Mhm.
sick child.
Right.
But on the other hand, I think as a poverty reporter, I went there very much with material questions in mind. I wanted to know what square footage of the house and what was the average caloric intake and the water system coming into the squatter. And really, when I got to know Tita, what was on her mind was her faith, her family, and her obligations to her siblings, and how to balance those with the kind of community work she was trying to do. And it just was a very different set of questions. It really broadened my perspective, and as a poverty reporter, to see um, that the material descriptions of her life, as essential as they were only part of the story, and there was so much more going on in her mind, in her interior life. It broadened my own sense of what kinds of questions were worth asking. And I definitely felt it was a contrast with the U.S. I've been writing about housing projects in the U.S. There was much less violence in the Philippines. I think the nuclear family had survived, or the extended family had survived in a stronger fashion in the Philippines. There was, without romanticizing it, I would say there were a lot of points of strength. And I think the experience of being poor is probably also different in a community or in a country where it's more of the norm. Whereas in the United States, if you're growing up poor, there's I think a implicit sense often of failure or exclusion. In a way that the Philippines, it was more of that didn't make you different. It made you Filipino. I mean,
Right, made you Filipino like everyone else. Right. Well, I'll start getting into the questions here. We have a lot of great questions here, but before that, let me just ask, what are some favorite Filipino dishes that you like? So when you visit, when I
I'm
can
an
start with
adobo man, Joel.
you are an adobo man. Pork or chicken? Which one are you?
Beef steak Tagalog
Oh, beef
and
Tagalog.
ube halaya is
Ube
my favorite.
halaya. Ube
Uh,
is really big now. We're this community has just rediscovered ube. So all my Filipino chefs and friends have been making me ube desserts left and right, which they need to stop because it's
no, they need to. They need to. We'll go. Just talk to me offline. I'll send you my address. Right?
all right, we'll
Yeah.
do. Well, our first question here, Jason, is from one of our board members, Ring Sai. Hi, Ring. Her question is, do you have a chance to compare, or did you have a chance to compare the public school education in the Philippines with the U.S. system? Is the opportunity to get good education better in the Philippines?
Huh. Um, what struck me about the big difference, well, two big differences in public education. One, the class sizes were much smaller in the in Texas. So Laura, I think, had maybe 70 kids in her class in the Philippines. I mean, the schools were really overcrowded, and the ethos. So she got much more individual attention, and the ethos in even in the Texas public schools in elementary, young age, was really about developing your own individual opinions, your own individual voice. In a way that I perceived Laura's education had not been. Like in the Philippines, she was expected to listen to the teacher and follow the teacher's orders, and it was it tended to be more rote, not thinking for herself. And so what happened with Laura is the opportunity. She had much more opportunity to express her curiosity in the U.S. Her curiosity was encouraged. In the Philippines, I think she felt like her care. She eventually articulated this to me, even though she's a little girl, that she felt like she wasn't encouraged to ask questions. Mommy didn't want to hear questions, or grandma didn't want to hear questions. The teacher didn't have time for questions. American teachers loved questions. So Laura would come in and say, "Why is the Leaning Tower of Pisa leaning?" And do fish sleep? And is Galveston an empire? And you could see this little mind just sort of filled with things she wanted to ask. And her third grade teacher, of course, charmed as I was about this little girl wanting to ask her a question. So so I guess I wouldn't say that. I think she had good educational opportunities in the U.S., even though I didn't really expect to see that much in a big public school system like
Right.
that.
Right. Another question here posed by one of our board members, Love Yascone. My friend from college is Filipino, but her family went with accounting instead of nursing. That's my story, Love. That's how my father came here. Have you ever met similar families that immigrated outside the medical field? My friend's family worked for the city government as accountants in Chicago.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of accountants. Like I said, that Rosalie had two Filipino accountants, one of whom so balut in the room. And I mean, the other thing that happened, I saw, in terms of like the wisdom of the Filipino community. So Chris found his job. He wound up working for the city, just like you're talking about. He's an engineer, but he wasn't board certified. So he's really working kind of a maintenance job for the city water department. But he found his job at the Filipino food store. Not in the want ads, but he struck up a conversation while he was shopping for fish one day, and the guy worked for the city government and was a generation older than Chris, but saw a fine young man and wanted to help him, and began sort of bringing food to the house, and they became friends, and he helped him, met him and got into the Filipino network. So which definitely include dentists, include nurses, include a lot of professional people. I mean, disproportionately medical, but not only.
Mhm.
And they had a collective. It was a real source of strength, of job tips, of school tips, of where to go for housing.
All right. We have a question here from Beverly Lang Pierce, who has been very instrumental in having this happen. It has now been 2 years since your book came out. How is the family doing now? Are they continuing to thrive?
Yeah, through a lot of adversity. I mean, my God, COVID. She Rosalie's a nurse. She's having to work, and then this past week, of course, everything in Texas. The kids are out of school. There's COVID, and then there's the freeze in Texas. So Chris, who works for the city water department, had to go live in a hotel to make sure he was on duty all the time and keeping the water going. Two of the kids have gone back to school. Laura, the middle child, is still doing by Zoom. But they've Christine, who's now a senior in high school, she's got a job working in the mall. She used to say she wanted to be a CIA agent or a spy, either a stewardess. She wasn't sure, but now she's talking about going to nursing school.
Oh, wow.
They're doing great. They're just doing, and to have witnessed the various struggles when they couldn't speak English, when they were having, they'd never really lived together as a family. They had been, because the parents had been in the Middle East while the kids were mostly in the Philippines with the grandparents, and they had to come. They not only had to come together in a new country, but they had to come together really almost as a new nuclear family. They've done fantastic.
Well, great. We have a couple more questions here. So this question is from Jim Craig. Wealth inequality, corruption, and lack of opportunity create people's desire to immigrate, typically. My family on both sides, Europe and Asia, came here for those reasons. Why else would you leave home and family? Well, political prosecution, Dad's family were religious minorities, but Grand migrated to France from Greece to escape corruption, poverty, and lack of opportunity. But did the people you got to know have any comment on their governments, societies, and geopolitical situation? Or is that not something that they thought about? Why do global organizations not try to balance out this dynamic to stem the root cause of this instability and pain that migration causes separated families? Filipinos rock. I am from Hawaii. Best care, respect to all.
Wow, that's a big question.
That's a big question, yeah.
I would say the diaspora community has varying opinions about Philippine politics. I mean, as did the family. Tita, Rosalie's mother, was from a kind of pro-Marcos family, rural and poor, but kind of pro-Marcos, and would say things like, the Filipino is hard-headed. He needs a strong man to, and Tita was anti-Marcos, and Sister Christine was one of the leading, she's a friend of Cory Aquino's from a very elite Filipino family. She was the when I met her, she was on commission, yes, of the, she'd been appointed as the representative of the urban poor on the commission that was drafting a new constitution for Aquino. And her slum group, of which Tita was a part, was kind of part of the pro Aquino, get out the vote, going to protest. So Rosalie grew up, I think, kind of torn between her, well, she going to pro Aquino rallies, but having Marcos cousins. And I think that same general tension plays out in the diaspora community to this day.
Another question is from Paula Robinson, one of our treasurer here, who helps keep our financials in order. I appreciate it. Do you think that Rosalie will return to the Philippines when she retires?
Rosalie used to say that she was going to return to the
Philippines. My mom and dad used to say too.
She actually owns a house that she bought that she's never lived in the Philippines, that she's still paying for. Chris especially said he was going to retire. I have a hard time imagining that she would, she would leave her kids, because the kids aren't going back. The kids can't speak Tagalog. Their lives, their opportunities are here. I don't see Rosalie leaving her children or her grandchildren. Now, would she go back for visits for a couple months at a time? Perhaps, probably. But there's really not that much there. Her dad died recently. Tita's now in her 70s and not in great health. I mean, she's not gonna, by the time Rosalie retires, she may be gone as well. And Rosalie's siblings, all but one are in the Middle East. So I don't know that she's fully faced up to that, but I take that back. I think she has. She waited 4 years to go back for her first visit, which was a long time. And at first I thought it was just financial, but I think there was a part of her that really wanted to get herself psychologically established in the US before she went back. And I went with her to the family reunion after 4 years. And there was a kind of a wrenching scene at the end where her father, Emmett, was very ill and had a stroke. And they were saying goodbye as we were all trying to pile into the car to go back to the airport after this 3-week visit. And, you could tell it was probably the last time Rosalie was going to see him. And he kept saying to her, I may not see you again, holding her hand. He was in a wheelchair, and she was saying, oh, we'll see each other. We'll see each other. And we get in the car, and I thought maybe she was going to burst out of crying, or it was going to be a really difficult ride back to the airport, and after this kind of sad goodbye. And instead, Rosalie looked at me and she said, I feel like I'm going home. The U.S. is now my home. And earlier, when she first got in here, there was times when she cried and said it was all a mistake and wished she hadn't come and wanted to go back to the Philippines. So it was really quite a 180-degree turn. And I guess I'd say probably, but at this point, Rosalie would probably say she's not going back.
Yeah, that's like my story when I remember saying I went back to the Philippines and the two regions, Manila and Davao, where my family is from, and brought a buy-on box, thinking that I'd see a big family. But yeah, the majority of them are here, and you actually answered my question. I was wondering if Rosalie petitioned anyone to come here to the States, but it looks like they're all in the Middle East, where my other side of my family is as well. Okay, we have one final question here.
And she hasn't lived there since, she was in the Middle East for 15 years before she came here. So she lived there in 25 years. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. One final question from Paul Lang, our supporter, one of our big supporters here. I have many Filipino friends out here in California. Many of them were nurses in their motherland, but aren't able to pursue nursing in the U.S. because of differing quote unquote credentials. As a result, they do not pursue additional education to obtain their credential. How would you propose they get similar credentialing in the Philippines so that they can qualify as nurses in the U.S. when they migrate over here? Is this even possible?
Certainly it's possible. There are two different tests that you can take. One's called the IELTS and one's called the CGFNS. And I know this because Rosalie, I think she had to take it maybe 5 times to pass. it's difficult. And the two tests differ, and it used to be that the IELTS was only offered in the US, but she actually took it in Saipan because it's a US territory. There's it's a big industry. The test prep, thing in the Philippines, just like it is in the US, where there's companies and tutors and and people don't make it and they end up working as CNAs and much lesser paid. But you have to get through that. You have to get through one of the two foreign nursing tests. When Rosalie graduated from nursing school, that was only the beginning of many, many years of continuing to pursue that credential. It took her 15 years to get it.
Well, I just have to say, if I ever go visit the DC area, which should be pretty soon, I'm looking forward to you, Jason, and Beverly to treat me to Bad Saint, because that's the restaurant I hear that we all need to go to. And
If you can get in, that's the problem.
If you could get in. So with that, with no other further questions, I would like to take this opportunity. Jason and Kathy, thank you so much. This conversation has really enriched my life here, enriched my heart. So I would like to thank you all so very much for joining us in this conversation. Thank you all attendees for welcoming joining us here at Crane House for our new normal, at least for the next 6 months. So with that being said, this is on Facebook Live. We'll have the recording, and I will make sure I send the recording to every participant who attended. And Jason in DC, Kathy in California, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. And
Salamat.
Salamat, walang anuman. That's the few Tagalog that I know. But I will make sure I brush up on my Filipino beefsteak and my adobo and all that.
Bring the ube.
And ube too. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jason.
Thank you all.
Joel.
Have
Thanks,
a
That was
great
Kathy.
really
evening
wonderful.
and have a great day. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Take
Bye
care.
now. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Right. Thank you, Kathy and Jason. I appreciate you both, and you all have
It was
a great day.
great. It
Thank
was really
you.
great.
I'll
Thanks,
send
Joel.
you a copy of this, and thank you again.
All right.
Yeah,
Take
you have a
care.
good day. Bye now.
Bye.